Imagine being abandoned while pregnant, during a storm, in the middle of nowhere. Today, I'll tell you a true story that will change how you see life. Leave in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Let's get into the story. Jonathan Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 47th floor of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, his steel-gray eyes scanning the city below as if it were his personal kingdom. At 42, he had mastered the art of control. His perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, his meticulously styled salt and pepper hair, and the precise way he held his Mont Blanc pen between his fingers, everything about him screamed perfection. "Mr. Pierce," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "your wife is here to see you." Jonathan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Send her in," he replied, not moving from his position. He could see Emily's reflection in the window as she entered, her 8-month pregnant belly preceding her like a shield. Even in her condition, she maintained the image he demanded. Designer maternity wear, perfectly styled honey blonde hair, and that constant look of gentle submission that had attracted him to her 3 years ago. "I thought we could have lunch together," Emily said softly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "The doctor's appointment went well, and I wanted to share the details with you." Jonathan turned, his expression calculated. "I have a merger meeting in 20 minutes. You should have called ahead." He walked to his desk, picking up his phone to scroll through emails he'd already read. Emily's face fell slightly, but she quickly recovered, a skill she perfected over their marriage. "Of course, I'm sorry. I just thought, since you missed the last 3 appointments, the company doesn't run itself, Emily." He cut her off, his tone clipped. "Speaking of which, have you confirmed our attendance at the Chapman's charity gala next week? It's crucial for our image, especially with the baby coming. The timing couldn't be better for our public profile." Emily's hand tightened slightly on her belly. I was thinking maybe we could skip this one. The doctor suggested I start taking it easier." Jonathan's eyes snapped up from his phone. "Skip it? Do you have any idea how important these connections are? This isn't just about social climbing, Emily. This is about securing our child's future. Everything we do, is about maintaining our position." He stood and walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that looked caring but felt like a vice grip. "You knew what you were signing up for when you married me. The parties, the galas, the perfect image. It's all part of the package. It's what keeps us at the top." Emily's green eyes glistened slightly, but she blinked back any trace of tears. "Yes, of course. You're right. I'll confirm our attendance today." "Good," Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's my girl. Now, I need to prepare for my meeting. Why don't you have Marcus drive you home? Get some rest. You're looking a bit tired." As Emily turned to leave, Jonathan's assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Pierce, the board members are gathering in the conference room." Perfect timing. Jonathan straightened his tie. "Emily, we'll discuss the doctor's appointment over dinner. If I make it home in time." He barely glanced at her as he gathered his papers, his mind already on his next conquest. Standing in the doorway, Emily watched her husband transform into the corporate warrior she'd first fallen for, confident, powerful, unstoppable. But now, after 3 years of marriage, she saw what she'd been blind to during their whirlwind courtship. The cold calculation behind every gesture, the way he treated their marriage like another business acquisition, and how their unborn child was just another asset in his perfectly controlled portfolio. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, one hand protectively cradling her belly, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself in Jonathan's perfectly constructed world. But with the baby coming, she told herself things would change. They had to change. Little did she know that change was coming, but not in any way she could have possibly imagined. The Montana sky darkened ominously as Jonathan's Range Rover wound through the empty mountain roads. They were returning from what Emily had hoped would be a romantic weekend getaway at the exclusive resort at Paws Up, a last attempt to reconnect before the baby arrived. Instead, it had been filled with business calls, missed dinner reservations, and terse conversations. Emily watched raindrops begin to splatter against the windshield, each one seeming to echo the growing tension in the car. They hadn't spoken for the last hour, not since their argument at the resort when Jonathan had received yet another urgent call during what was supposed to be their private breakfast. "Maybe we should stop somewhere," Emily suggested, eyeing the threatening clouds. "The weather's getting worse." Jonathan's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "We're already behind schedule. I have a meeting tomorrow morning." "It's Sunday tomorrow," Emily said softly, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly as the baby kicked, sensing her anxiety. "The Tokyo markets don't care what day it is here," he snapped. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the rigid set of his jaw. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the car. Through the torrent, Emily could barely make out the dense forest on either side of the narrow road. They were miles from anywhere, in that stretch of Montana wilderness that had once seemed romantic but now felt oppressive. Suddenly, Jonathan pulled the car over to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. "What are you doing?" Emily asked, her heart rate quickening for reasons she couldn't explain. Jonathan stared straight ahead, his voice eerily calm. "Get out." "What?" Emily laughed nervously, certain she had misheard him. "Get out of the car, Emily." His words were precise, calculated, like everything else about him. "Jonathan, this isn't funny. It's pouring, and we're in the middle of nowhere." He turned to face her, and Emily recoiled at the coldness in his eyes. "I've been thinking about this for weeks. I can't do it anymore. The pregnancy, the expectations, the responsibility. It's suffocating me. This isn't what I wanted." "What you wanted?" Emily's voice cracked. "We planned this baby together. We tried for months." "No, you wanted this. I went along with it because it was the next logical step for my image. A power couple needs an heir, right?" His laugh was hollow. "But I've realized I don't want to be tied down. Not to a baby, not to you." Thunder crashed overhead as Emily's world imploded. "Jonathan, please. I'm 8 months pregnant. You can't just. There's a town about 10 miles ahead." He cut her off, reaching across her to open her door. The wind whipped rain into the car. "Someone will help you. They love helping people in these small towns, don't they? Isn't that what all those heartwarming stories are about?" "Jonathan." Emily grabbed his arm. "This is insane. I'm your wife. This is your child." His face hardened as he pried her fingers from his sleeve. "Not anymore. I'll have my lawyers contact you. You'll be well provided for. I'm not completely heartless, but I want you gone. Both of you. You're going to regret this," Emily whispered, tears mixing with the rain that was now soaking her clothes. "The only thing I regret," Jonathan said, his voice devoid of emotion, "is not doing this sooner. Now get out." Emily's legs shook as she stepped out into the storm. The moment her second foot touched the ground, Jonathan accelerated, spraying gravel in his wake. She watched the taillights disappear into the rain, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. The wind howled through the trees, and another lightning bolt illuminated the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions. Emily stood frozen, one hand on her belly, the other pressed against her mouth to hold back a scream that threatened to tear her apart. Her designer dress, chosen specially for their weekend getaway, clung to her body as the Montana storm raged around her, as wild and uncontrolled as the terror rising in her chest. The savage Montana rain pelted Emily's skin like icy needles as she stumbled along the deserted road, her designer heels sinking into the muddy shoulder with each desperate step. The darkness was absolute, broken only by sporadic flashes of lightning that transformed the looming pines into grotesque shadows. Her sodden dress, a $3,000 Valentino that Jonathan had insisted she pack for their romantic weekend, now clung to her body like a lead weight. "Help!" she screamed into the howling wind, knowing it was futile. Her voice, once confident in Manhattan's finest restaurants, now sounded small and broken against the vastness of the wilderness. "Somebody, please." A sharp pain gripped her abdomen, causing her to double over. "No, no, no," she whispered, cradling her swollen belly. "Not now, sweetheart. Please not now." The baby kicked in response, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. Emily's mind raced through memories, searching for signs she should have seen. The way Jonathan's smile never quite reached his eyes when they discussed the nursery. How he'd insisted on this remote getaway despite her doctor's concerns about traveling so late in the pregnancy. The casual way he'd mentioned that his lawyer had some routine paperwork for her to sign next week. "I've been so stupid," she choked out, leaning against a tree as another contraction rippled through her body. Her perfectly manicured nails, now broken and dirty, dug into the rough bark. So incredibly stupid. Lightning crackled overhead, followed immediately by deafening thunder. Emily screamed and instinctively covered her belly, sliding down the trunk until she sat in the mud. Her thoughts turned to her mother's warnings 3 years ago. "He's too perfect, Emily. No one is that perfect without hiding something." But she'd been dazzled by Jonathan's world. The penthouse overlooking Central Park, the private jets, the endless stream of galas and champagne. She convinced herself that his controlling nature was just part of what made him successful, that his emotional distance would change when the baby came. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, her hand trembling as she pushed wet hair from her face. Her phone was in her purse, in the car with Jonathan. Her wallet, too. She had nothing except the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Emily could feel herself shivering uncontrollably. She knew enough about wilderness survival from forced corporate retreats to understand that she needed to find shelter soon. Hypothermia could kill her, kill them both, in hours. Standing took all her remaining strength. Her legs felt like rubber, and her designer shoes, now ruined beyond repair, threatened to betray her with each step. The irony wasn't lost on her. How many pairs of $1,000 shoes had she accumulated in her closet, trying to fit Jonathan's image of the perfect wife? Now she would trade them all for a pair of sturdy boots and a warm coat. Emily forced herself to keep moving, one hand always protectively on her belly. The baby's movements had become more agitated, matching her own distress. "It's okay," she murmured, trying to convince herself as much as the child. "We're going to be okay. We don't need him. We never needed him." But as another blast of icy wind cut through her wet clothes, Emily felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. All her life, she'd prided herself on being independent, capable. Then she'd let Jonathan gradually strip that away, replacing her confidence with an elaborate facade of perfection. Now, lost in the Montana wilderness, 8 months pregnant, she faced the terrifying reality that her survival and her baby's depended entirely on her ability to find that strength again. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, softer now, as if the storm was moving on. But Emily knew the real storm was just beginning. Through the thinning rain, a pair of amber eyes watched Emily from the shadows of the pines. The German shepherd stood motionless, his muscular body tense with attention, ears forward as he observed the struggling woman. His thick coat, dark with rain, blended perfectly with the twilight forest. Emily didn't notice him at first, too focused on each painful step, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until she heard the soft crunch of paws on wet gravel that she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hello," she called out weakly, her voice trembling. In the dim light, she could barely make out the dog's silhouette. Her mind raced with half-remembered stories about wild animals in Montana. Wolves, bears, mountain lions. But as another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, she saw him clearly. A magnificent German shepherd, watching her with an almost human-like intelligence. The dog took a careful step forward, his head slightly lowered, tail level, neither aggressive nor submissive. He was clearly no stray. His coat, though wet, was well-maintained, and he moved with the confident grace of a trained animal. But there was no collar around his thick neck. Are you someone's dog?" Emily asked, remaining still. The shepherd tilted his head at the sound of her voice, his ears perking forward. "Is your home nearby?" As if in response, the dog moved closer, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. When he was about 10 feet away, he sat down, still watching her intently. Emily noticed how he positioned himself, slightly angled toward a narrow path leading into the forest that she hadn't seen before. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, and Emily gasped, doubling over. Instantly, the shepherd was at her side, pressing his solid warmth against her leg, offering support. She instinctively grabbed his fur to steady herself, and he remained perfectly still until the pain passed. "Thank you," she whispered, surprised by the tears in her eyes. The dog's fur was thick and warm despite the rain, and he smelled of pine needles and earth, nothing like the pampered poodles and Yorkies she was used to seeing in Central Park. The shepherd gently pulled away, taking a few steps toward the path before turning to look at her again. He waited, watching, then took a few more steps and repeated the gesture. "You want me to follow you?" Emily asked incredulously. The dog's tail wagged once, and he took another step toward the path. Emily glanced back at the main road, empty and dark in both directions, then down at her muddy designer dress and ruined shoes. She had no idea how far the nearest town might be, and her body was telling her she couldn't walk much further. "I must be crazy," she muttered, but found herself taking a tentative step toward the dog. He immediately brightened, his tail wagging more enthusiastically, though he maintained his dignified bearing. As they moved away from the road, Emily noticed how the shepherd constantly checked on her, adjusting his pace to match her labored steps. When the path grew steep or slippery, he would wait patiently, positioning himself so she could steady herself against his solid frame. "I don't suppose you have a name?" Emily asked, needing to hear a voice, even her own in the darkness. The dog's ear twitched at her words. "I think I'll call you Max. You look like a Mac." At the sound of the name, the shepherd turned and gave her what could only be described as an approving look. For the first time since Jonathan had driven away, Emily felt a small smile tugging at her lips. "Max it is then," she said softly. The dog responded with a gentle woof, the first sound she'd heard him make. It was as if they'd just signed some sort of contract, a partnership born of desperation and trust. They continued through the forest, Max leading the way with quiet confidence. Emily had no idea where they were going, but she realized that following this strange, noble animal felt infinitely safer than remaining on that empty road. Somehow, in the span of mere minutes, this dog had shown her more genuine care than Jonathan had in months. Through the dense Montana forest, Max led Emily along a winding path that seemed to have been crafted by years of animal traffic. The rain had finally subsided to a gentle mist, but Emily's exhaled breath still formed visible clouds in the cold night air. Her feet, blistered and aching in her ruined Louboutins, stumbled over exposed roots and slick stones. "Please tell me we're almost somewhere, Max," Emily whispered. One hand braced against a rough pine trunk while the other cradled her belly. The German shepherd paused, turning to face her with those intelligent amber eyes, before trotting back to stand supportively at her side. Suddenly, the dense forest opened up into a small clearing, and Emily gasped. There, silhouetted against the clearing sky, stood an old barn. Its weathered red paint was peeling, and parts of the roof had clearly seen better days, but to Emily, it looked like salvation. "Oh my God," she breathed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Max gave an encouraging bark, only his second vocalization since finding her, and led the way toward the structure. The barn's large double doors were secured with an old chain, but Max confidently padded around to the side, where a smaller door hung slightly ajar. Emily followed, having to duck to enter the dark space. The air inside was musty but dry, and significantly warmer than outside. "Hello," she called out cautiously. "Is anyone here?" Only the soft whisper of wind through the barn's aging boards answered her. Max moved purposefully through the darkness, and Emily heard the rustle of hay. Following the sound, she found herself in what appeared to be an old horse stall, filled with relatively fresh hay. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she asked Max, who had already settled himself at the entrance to the stall, his posture alert and protective. The shepherd's ears twitched in response, but his eyes remained fixed on the barn's entrance. Emily sank gratefully into the hay, surprised by how soft and dry it was. Her body was trembling from exhaustion and cold, and her wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin. Looking around, she spotted some old horse blankets folded on a shelf nearby. They smelled of dust and age, but they were dry. "I never thought I'd be grateful for horse blankets," she murmured, wrapping one around her shoulders and laying another over the hay to sit on. The baby kicked vigorously, as if expressing approval at finally being somewhere warm and dry. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Emily began to make out more details of her surroundings. The barn was clearly abandoned, but not derelict. Through gaps in the roof, she could see stars beginning to peek through the breaking clouds. The storm had passed. "I don't suppose you know whose barn this is?" she asked Max, who had relaxed slightly but maintained his vigilant position. "I hope they don't mind us being here." Her hands shook as she tried to arrange the blankets into something resembling a bed. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was 8 months pregnant, alone in an abandoned barn in the Montana wilderness, with only a mysterious German shepherd for company. No phone, no money, no identification. Nothing except a ruined designer dress and a stranger's dog who had appeared like some kind of guardian angel. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, one hand absently stroking her belly. The baby moved again, and Emily felt a different kind of contraction. Not the terrifying ones from earlier, but the Braxton Hicks she'd become familiar with over the past few weeks. Still, she knew she needed to find real help soon. She couldn't give birth in an abandoned barn. Max got up and padded over to her, laying his head gently on her lap. Emily buried her fingers in his thick fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Thank you," she said softly, scratching behind his ears. "I don't know where you came from or why you helped me, but thank you." As if in response, Max shifted closer, pressing his warm body against her side. For the first time since Jonathan had abandoned her on that dark road, Emily felt something besides fear and despair. In this dusty old barn, wrapped in horse blankets with a mysterious dog standing guard, she felt the first tiny spark of hope. Outside, an owl hooted softly, and a gentle Montana breeze whispered through the gaps in the barn walls. Emily's eyelids grew heavy as exhaustion finally overtook her. Her last conscious thought before drifting off to sleep was that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning. Days turned into weeks at the old McAllister barn. Emily had discovered the name carved into one of the beams. She'd also learned that the property had been abandoned for years after the family moved to Oregon, information gleaned from the elderly woman at Mason's General Store in the nearby town of Wolf Creek, where Emily now worked part-time. The morning sun filtered through the patched barn roof as Emily folded her newly washed waitress uniform. She'd come a long way from designer dresses and charity galas. Her once manicured hands were now calloused from cleaning tables and carrying plates, but they were hands that had built something real. "What do you think, Max?" she asked, looking down at her faithful companion. "Time for our morning walk?" The German shepherd's tail wagged as he stood from his usual spot by her makeshift bed. In the weeks since he'd found her, Max had never left her side for more than an hour, somehow understanding that she needed him more than ever. The town had been surprisingly welcoming once Emily had worked up the courage to seek help. She told them a simplified version of her story, a pregnant woman left by her husband. It was enough to earn their sympathy without inviting too many questions. Sarah Mason, the store owner's wife, had immediately offered her the waitressing job and helped her set up temporary residence in the barn, which the town collectively watched over as abandoned property. "Good morning, Emily," called Dr. Henderson from his front porch as she and Max walked past. The elderly veterinarian had been one of her first allies in town, providing Max with a checkup and shots free of charge. "How's our mama-to-be doing today?" "Better every day, Doc," Emily replied, resting a hand on her now full-term belly. "Though this little one seems to be getting impatient, well, you know where to find me if you need anything. And don't forget your appointment with Dr. Reynolds tomorrow." Emily nodded gratefully. The local physician had agreed to take her case pro bono, understanding her unusual situation. She'd refused to touch the substantial check Jonathan's lawyers had sent, blood money, as far as she was concerned. She was determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. Walking through the morning quiet town with Max, Emily reflected on how much she'd changed. The woman who had once spent hours perfecting her makeup now comfortably wore just a touch of mascara. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by practical second-hand clothes, and her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Morning, Emily," called Betty from the diner. "You're not working today, are you? You should be resting." "Just taking our morning walk," Emily assured her. The doctor says it's good for me. Max stayed close as they made their way to their favorite spot, a small hill overlooking the valley. Emily lowered herself carefully onto a fallen log, something she would have never done in her previous life. Now, the peace of the forest and the majesty of the Montana mountains filled her with a sense of belonging she'd never felt in Manhattan. "You know what, Max?" she said, scratching behind his ears. "I think we're going to be okay. Really okay. Not just pretending to be okay like before." The shepherd pressed his head against her hand, his amber eyes full of understanding. Emily had learned more about genuine loyalty from this dog than she had in all her years in high society. A sharp kick from the baby made her smile. "You too, little one. We're all going to be okay." Her due date was less than a week away now, and though the thought of single motherhood was terrifying, she felt stronger than ever. The morning sun caught the gold band still on her finger, and Emily realized it was time. Carefully sliding off her wedding ring, she held it up to the light. This small circle of metal had once represented everything she thought she wanted: status, security, success. Now it just felt like the last chain to a life that had never been truly hers. Standing up, Emily drew back her arm and threw the ring as far as she could into the valley below. Max barked once, as if applauding her decision, and Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Come on, boy," she said, turning back toward town. "We've got a nursery to finish painting." The nursery was actually a converted horse stall, transformed with the help of the townspeople who had embraced her as one of their own. It wasn't the luxury nursery she planned in Manhattan, but it was filled with something far more valuable: genuine care and community. The 47th floor of the Pierce Tower felt smaller somehow. Jonathan stood at his once commanding windows, but the Manhattan skyline no longer felt like his kingdom. The past months had taken their toll, evident in the slight dishevelment of his usually impeccable appearance. "Mr. Pierce," his new assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board members are requesting an update on the Morgan merger." Jonathan's jaw tightened. The Morgan deal, once his sure bet, was crumbling, like everything else. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," he snapped, loosening his tie slightly. The designer suit that once felt like armor now seemed to suffocate him. "And sir," the assistant added hesitantly, "Mr. Davidson from the Journal called again. He's asking for comment on the rumors about your personal life affecting company stability." Jonathan slammed his hand on the intercom button. "No comment." "And Sarah?" "Screen my calls better." Alone again, he picked up the morning's Wall Street Journal. His own face stared back at him from the business section. Pierce empire showing cracks. Is personal scandal to blame? The article detailed his company's recent setbacks, cleverly weaving in mentions of his controversial personal decisions and questions of character. His phone buzzed. Another text from Richard Chapman. "Missing you and Emily at the gala last night. Board members noticed. We need to talk." The Chapman's charity gala, once his favorite hunting ground for business connections, now a minefield of whispered conversations and judging stares. The same people who had once laughed at his jokes and praised his business acumen now exchanged knowing looks behind his back. "Damn it," he muttered, pushing away from his desk. The office felt like a cage. His eyes fell on the spot where Emily had stood that last day, her pregnant belly preceding her like an accusation. He'd thought cutting her loose would free him. Instead, a knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "What?" he barked. James Morton, his CFO and oldest friend, entered without waiting for permission. "The numbers from Q3 are in," he said without preamble. "It's not good, John. We've weathered downturns before. This is different." James dropped a folder on his desk. "Our major investors are nervous." The Morgan family specifically mentioned concerns about leadership stability in their latest communication. Jonathan leafed through the reports, his stomach churning. "It's all perception. Nothing's changed in how I run this company." "Everything's changed," James said quietly. "You abandoned your pregnant wife in the middle of nowhere, John. People talk. Our clients have wives, daughters. They see you differently now." "It was a private matter," Jonathan growled. "It has nothing to do with business." "Everything has to do with business. Isn't that what you always said?" James moved toward the door, then paused. "You know what the worst part is? Emily would know exactly how to handle this PR nightmare. She always knew how to make you look human. After James left, Jonathan sank into his leather chair, suddenly aware of the silence in his office. No calls from Emily asking about dinner plans. No updates about doctor's appointments or nursery colors. Just silence and the growing realization that his perfectly controlled world was spiraling beyond his grasp. His phone buzzed again, this time an email from his lawyer. Another society wife was filing for divorce, citing his story as inspiration. His reputation as New York's most eligible divorcee-to-be wasn't attracting the attention he'd expected. Instead, women at events steered their daughters away from him, and mothers with strollers gave him cold stares in Central Park. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Pierce? The board is waiting." Jonathan straightened his tie, put on his game face. But as he walked toward the conference room, he felt the stares of his employees, heard the whispers that stopped when he got too close. His steps, once confident strides across his personal empire, now felt like a walk of shame. He had always believed that control was power. Now, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt hollow, he was beginning to understand that he had controlled everything except what truly mattered. 3 years had transformed Wolf Creek's small Main Street into home for Emily. She navigated the familiar sidewalk, now pushing a stroller with one hand, while Max padded faithfully beside her. Her daughter, Sophie, babbled happily from her seat, her dark curls bouncing with each step. "Almost there, sweetie," Emily said, pausing to adjust Sophie's sun hat. "Just need to pick up a few things from Aunt Sarah's store." The bell above Mason's general store chimed as they entered. Max immediately tensed, his ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Max?" Emily frowned. The shepherd had never shown aggression in the store before. Then she heard a familiar voice that made her blood freeze. "I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here about 3 years ago," Jonathan Pierce was saying to Sarah Mason, his back to the door. "A pregnant woman, blonde." "Emily?" Sarah interrupted, her eyes widening as she spotted her friend in the doorway. Jonathan turned, and time seemed to stop. He looked older, grayer, the perfectly pressed suit somehow not sitting quite right on his frame. His eyes moved from Emily to Sophie, then to Max, who had positioned himself protectively between them. "Emily," he breathed, taking a step forward. Max's growl deepened, and Jonathan froze. "Sarah," Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady, "could you take Sophie for a minute?" The older woman hurried around the counter, scooping up the curious toddler. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go check on those new candy shipments." Once they were gone, Emily squared her shoulders. "What are you doing here, Jonathan?" "I've been looking for you," he said, his usual confidence noticeably absent. "Your trail was impressively hard to follow." That was the point. Emily's hand found Max's fur, drawing strength from his solid presence. "How did you find me?" "Someone at the hospital in Helena remembered a case about a woman giving birth in a barn during a snowstorm. Said it made the local papers." He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That sounds like quite a story." "It is. But it's not your story." Emily's voice was firm. "You gave up any right to our stories when you left us on that road." Jonathan's facade cracked slightly. I know what I did was. I've thought about that night every day since. The company's struggling. Everything's struggling. I thought I could just go back to my old life. But let me stop you right there." Emily cut him off. "I'm not interested in why you did it or how hard things have been for you. The time for those conversations was 3 years ago." She looked different, Jonathan realized. Her designer clothes were replaced by simple jeans and a comfortable blouse. Her once perfectly styled hair was in a practical braid, but it was her eyes that had changed the most. They held a strength he'd never seen before, a confidence that had nothing to do with social status or appearance. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Our daughter." "My daughter," Emily corrected him. "Sophie has a whole community of people who love her, who have been there since the day she was born. She doesn't need a father who only shows up when his life stops going according to plan." Max punctuated her words with another growl, and Jonathan took an involuntary step back. "The dog? He found you that night?" "Max saved us," Emily said. scratching the shepherd's ears. He's been more family to Sophie than you ever tried to be. The bell chimed again as local customers entered the store. They immediately sensed the tension, and Emily saw several of them, including Bill from the hardware store and Dr. Henderson, position themselves protectively nearby. "You should go, Jonathan," Emily said quietly. "There's nothing for you here. I have resources." He tried one last time. "I could provide. I provide for my daughter," Emily interrupted. "We have everything we need right here. Goodbye, Jonathan." She turned away, walking toward the back of the store where she could hear Sophie's delighted giggles as Sarah undoubtedly spoiled her with candy. Max followed, but not before giving Jonathan one final warning growl. Standing alone in the middle of the store, surrounded by curious and hostile stares from Emily's protective small-town family, Jonathan Pierce, once the king of Manhattan, finally understood the true cost of his choices. The autumn air held a crisp bite as Jonathan lingered outside Mason's general store the next morning. He'd spent a sleepless night at Wolf Creek's only motel, his mind replaying the encounter with Emily and the daughter he'd never known. "She won't want to see you," Sarah Mason said firmly, stepping outside to sweep the storefront. Her tone made it clear she was more statement than warning. "I just need 5 minutes," Jonathan replied, his designer shoes gathering dust on the worn wooden boards of the sidewalk. "Please." Before Sarah could respond, Emily appeared at the end of the street, Sophie balanced on her hip and Max trotting beside them. The German shepherd spotted Jonathan first, his posture immediately stiffening. "Jonathan," Emily sighed, shifting Sophie to her other hip. "I thought I was clear yesterday." "Emily, please." He took a step forward, stopping when Max let out a low growl. "I've been thinking all night. I can change. I can be part of Sophie's life. I can. Buy her things?" Emily finished. "Throw money at her like you do with all your problems?" "No, that's not." "Then what, Jonathan? What exactly can you offer her?" Emily's voice was steady, but her eyes flashed. "A father who measures love in stock options? Who sees his child as a corporate asset?" Sophie, sensing the tension, buried her face in her mother's neck. The simple gesture seemed to break something in Jonathan. "She has your eyes," he said softly. "And your inability to sleep through thunderstorms," Emily replied, then immediately regretted sharing that intimate detail when she saw hope flicker across Jonathan's face. "Let me prove myself," he pleaded. "I can relocate the company's Western office to Helena. I could be nearby, get to know her gradually." Emily laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't a business negotiation. You can't strategize your way back into our lives. I have rights." Emily's voice rose slightly, causing several townspeople to pause their morning routines. "You forfeited any rights when you left us to die in that storm. Do you know what saved us that night? Not money, not power, not business connections. A stray dog showed more humanity than you ever did." Max pressed against Emily's leg, his amber eyes never leaving Jonathan. "The really sad thing," Emily continued, her voice softening, "is that you're still trying to control everything. You're not here because you love Sophie. You're here because for the first time in your life, something isn't going according to your perfect plan." Jonathan opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. In the morning light, he could see what he'd missed yesterday. The easy way Sophie fit on Emily's hip, the confident set of Emily's shoulders, the protective circle of townspeople who had casually arranged themselves within earshot. This wasn't the scared, abandoned woman he'd left on that road. This was someone who had rebuilt herself, stronger than before. "Go home, Jonathan," Emily said gently. "Go back to your boardrooms and your billion-dollar deals. We've built a life here, a real one, with people who love us for who we are, not what we represent. Sophie doesn't need your kind of love." As if to emphasize her mother's point, Sophie lifted her head and gave Jonathan a curious look, not of recognition or loss, but of polite disinterest, the way one might regard a stranger passing on the street. Jonathan felt something inside him crumble. All his prepared speeches, his carefully planned arguments, his promises of change, they felt hollow in the face of this simple truth. They didn't need him. More than that, they were better without him. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Behind him, He heard Sophie's delighted laugh as Emily pointed out something in a store window, and Max's protective bark as a car drove too fast down the street. The sounds of a family, one he could have had, but chose to throw away. On a crisp Montana evening 5 years after Jonathan's last visit, Emily sat on the porch of her newly purchased home on the outskirts of Wolf Creek. The modest 2-story farmhouse wasn't anything like her Manhattan penthouse, but its warmth and character spoke of something far more valuable than luxury. Sophie, now 8 years old, was chasing fireflies in the front yard, her dark curls bouncing in the twilight. Max, graying around his muzzle but still alert as ever, watched from his favorite spot near the porch steps. "Mom," Sophie called out, running up with cupped hands. "Look what I caught." Emily leaned forward to peek at the glowing insect in her daughter's palms. "Beautiful, sweetheart. Remember to let it go. Everything deserves to be free." The words carried a weight that Sophie wouldn't understand for many years. The little girl nodded solemnly before releasing the firefly, watching it dance away into the growing darkness. Sarah Mason's truck pulled into the gravel driveway, bringing supplies for tomorrow's town festival. Emily had been elected as this year's organizer, a far cry from the charity galas she used to attend, but infinitely more meaningful. "Aunt Sarah." Sophie bounded over to help carry boxes, already showing the strong sense of community that Wolf Creek had instilled in her. Emily watched her daughter, marveling at how she'd grown into a confident, kind-hearted child who saw beauty in simple things. She thought about the letter that had arrived last week, Jonathan's final attempt at contact, filled with news of his corporate success and another offer of financial support. She'd left it unopened on her desk, eventually using it to start that evening's fireplace. Max lifted his head suddenly, ears perking up at a sound only he could hear. A moment later, Dr. Henderson appeared around the bend in the road, walking his evening route. "Evening, Emily," he called out. "Ready for the big day tomorrow?" "As ready as we'll ever be," Emily laughed, watching Sophie demonstrate her firefly-catching technique to Sarah. The setting sun painted the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a sight that still took Emily's breath away even after all these years. She remembered how she used to chase artificial beauty, designer clothes, perfect makeup, the right accessories. Now, her greatest accessories were the laugh lines around her eyes and the small scar on her palm from building Sophie's treehouse. Max patted over and rested his head on her lap, his amber eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty that had saved her life that stormy night. Emily scratched behind his ears, remembering how he'd appeared like a guardian angel when she'd lost everything, or what she thought was everything. "You know what, Max?" she whispered. "We didn't just survive. We found something better than survival." The shepherd's tail wagged, gently in agreement. In the yard, Sophie was now teaching Sarah a complicated clapping game she'd invented, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. The porch light created a warm glow around them, and through the windows, Emily could see the homemade artwork and family photos that covered the walls, evidence of a life rich in what truly mattered. There was no grand mansion, no society parties, no private jets. Instead, there was love, community, and the kind of peace that money could never buy. Emily had learned that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find what you really needed. As the stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Emily thought about the woman she'd been in that Manhattan office, so desperate to fit into Jonathan's perfect world. She wished she could tell that version of herself that true happiness wasn't about controlling life, but about letting it unfold naturally, about finding strength in vulnerability and beauty in imperfection. Sophie ran back to the porch, breathless and happy, throwing her arms around both Emily and Max. "I love you, Mom," she said simply, before darting off again to continue her firefly hunt. Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of her daughter's words and Max's steady presence beside her. This was her empire, not built of glass and steel, but of love and trust and second chances. And unlike Jonathan's world of endless acquisition and control, this was something that could never be lost or taken away. In the end, she hadn't needed a powerful man to give her a fairy tale ending. She'd written her own story, one small brave choice at a time, and discovered that true happiness wasn't about having everything you thought you wanted. It was about wanting everything you already had. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon. And if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until here," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's very exciting.